So I'm also going to talk about something a little bit different. Well, I say different, but then there was a very, very good nod to research impact in the last session, Tasha, which I wasn't expecting. So, hey, that's great. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a move which has kind of taken us, I guess, a little further upstream in the research workflow. My bio was quite short. I'm going to put imposter syndrome to one side very briefly while I talk through this, but I'm going to put a warning in kind of now. This isn't really going to talk to anything technologically groundbreaking. It's more, I guess, a transition in trying as a publisher to help solve different problems, or at least a different type of problem. Like Tasha, I was originally given a brief that was much shorter than 40 minutes, so I think we'll all be pretty much done within the next 30 minutes. But anyway, I will crack on. And I'm going to talk about research impact. I'll split that to the side. It's very topical. It's on the agenda at many conferences dedicated to research management professionals and administrators, particularly, I guess, as well in the last few years with the Research Excellence Framework, or the REF, with that assessment window open. For anybody who doesn't know about the REF, lucky you. It's a process that happens circa every 7 years. It's expert review to provide accountability for kind of public investments in research and evidence the benefits of that investment. It also gets used to establish kind of reputational yardsticks, and very critically, it's used to inform the allocation of funding to the sector, and obviously money talks. As a result, the term has actually become very loaded. Depending on who you speak to, it's kind of subject to proxy measures of success that aren't all necessarily fit for purpose. So, you know, many globally will still think of it maybe as research attention. So is it citations? Is it publication within an impact factor journal? Or is it awareness? Is it a volume of social media? Is it public engagement and things like that? All of these things obviously vitally important, but not in and of themselves impact. At least in the way that we see it, impact, and there are multiple versions and playing around of the wording by various bodies and research councils, but it's change. Ultimately, the provable benefits of research in the world outside of academia. And therefore, impact kind of needs to be articulated and evidenced as such. So what's gone up, what's come down, what's improved, and what's declined. And it's becoming, I guess, much more prominent in researcher day-to-day life because there's a bit of a sea change. Partly in the way research is being evaluated, certainly within criteria for successful funding bids and applications, and slowly as well in the ways in which researchers are being incentivized and rewarded for their efforts. And I guess interestingly, all of these things should theoretically be good, right? I mean, the world would benefit if the primary goal was for research to get into the hands, ultimately, of those who can directly benefit from it. That research projects were designed kind of with this in mind, and due consideration was given to how this was going to happen, and ultimately what good looks like. And we would want research funding going to the places that can demonstrate kind of how the research is ultimately going to make a difference. But impact is still a major headache. A lot of research institutions aren't really geared up this way, and much of the pressure obviously still remains on making sure that research is published in a high-ranking title to be read largely by fellow academics. Those problems are obviously pretty big. We're also interested in another sub-problem here, which is that actually there's a distinct lack of, I guess, what we would call impact literacy in the sector, which is kind of that ability to understand, appraise, and therefore make decisions about how research resonates with the world outside of academia. And for us, kind of tackling this sort of problem marks, I guess, a bit of a step change in how we kind of try and support the academic community. You know, we, like many others, will provide much of our services around, I guess, ultimately making the most out of the research outputs. So support with dissemination activities, accessing the right type of audience, marketing support, guidance on kind of drumming up citations, giving people ultimately the tools they need to enable really quick and kind of open dissemination of their key outputs. But I guess kind of what we're talking about here is much earlier in the workflow. It's into planning for ultimately better research and stronger research outcomes. So ultimately we want to try and kind of help build a place that better connects the needs of funding with researchers and a place that supports planning for real impact to occur. But you know, we're far from experts in this field. I'm far from an expert in this field. We began a collaboration with two people who've been working in the field for a number of years. The term, in fact, impact literacy was coined by them following academic research that they'd conducted into research impact. And much of their kind of focus was on the connectivity of approaches that were being taken in places like Canada, where the emphasis was growing widely on knowledge mobilization, which is kind of like the how research was going to have an impact. And the UK emphasis on assessment, so kind of the what changes were happening as a result of research that was being undertaken, and how were they being measured, how were they being evidenced, and how were they being recorded. And these two very fabulous people worked with us on kind of converting the outputs of their research and framework recommendations into a couple of workbooks which we made available. One which focuses on the role of the institution in all of this. So that kind of spoke to reviewing how well set up your research institution is in enabling impact to thrive, the extent to which you have a culture of impact, whether it's reference in your mission and strategy, whether there's kind of clarity around these areas, and what impact ultimately even means if you work there. And then with all of that being kind of said, are you rewarding, I guess, the right behaviors? So Dr. David Phipps, who's featured here, he kind of runs workshops globally on institutional impact health. I say globally, I guess largely in North America and Canada, Australia, but Malaysia, parts of Europe, where kind of the impact narrative, I guess, is growing and becoming quite mature. And enthusiasm kind of on the subject matter was high, and we got examples of where people were kind of using the workbooks to inform their research strategies internally. The second workbook was kind of focused on the researchers themselves. Simple questions kind of being asked. When you look at your research project, what problem are you trying to solve? What change are you looking to try to effect? And given that impact is very, very unlikely to occur and happen in isolation, who do you need to work with, when, and how during the course of your research project? And I attended a number of kind of workshops at universities where these were being presented to researchers, and they were kind of being guided through them, banging heads against a wall, essentially to the tune of, I don't know what my impact is, but I think it's really fascinating, and I just want a lot of people to read it, which is great. However, the world is shifting, right? And kind of speaking as I did earlier, the conversation kind of around impact maturing. You know, there's the REF, of course, here in the UK, but kind of research assessment or variations of it exist and are growing around the world. And I guess kind of keen to build on the success of these workbooks, we began to bring in some partners to help us shape how we could even take this one sort of step further. And these partners were those kind enough to open the doors to their respective research offices so that we could kind of see where some of the impact challenges were happening firsthand. We uncovered, I guess, huge pressure on relatively thinly resourced sections of those departments to provide impact support to vast number of people within that university, particularly during assessment windows. So impact support specialists is kind of a role which is growing in popularity, but they vary in remits massively, and there's often one person flying the flag for impact, but against the tune of a 4-star impact case study, as would be reviewed in the Research Excellence Framework, said to be worth over £250,000 during that last REF window, which is clearly taking things pretty seriously, what it's unfortunately led to is there's a lot of staff movements during assessment windows, which is causing the impact headache to get even bigger. And following kind of more research that we'd done, testing out a few concepts, we decided to kind of create a new service that would support some of the main challenges that we'd identified kind of there. I guess an early challenge for us in trying to do anything new whatsoever. And it was interesting, I was speaking to Will at 67 Bricks earlier on, who knows Emerald pretty well. We are terrible at stopping things. Our list of things to do is just ginormous, and we're really bad at sort of cutting through the meat of all that. And we'd just kind of, as in literally just spent a significant amount of time and resource in building our own platform for all of our journals and books content. So that was long, it was painful, although ultimately successful. But everything at the time we wanted to try and do this needed a bit of room to kind of breathe, and fortunately the platform migration itself had kind of awoken some of the agile principles that we needed to really have a good go at sort of new products and new service development. But there existed still a fairly significant, as you can appreciate, backlog of things that we still needed to get done to ensure that customer experience was as optimal as it could be. For what was ultimately the core and bread and butter of our business. But we essentially made the business decision to kind of move away or move into kind of a much smaller unit, looking at impact support, take them entirely into a different space, which ultimately head into a different building, away from all of the noise, which I think is a lot more helpful in terms of innovation and creativity to kind of sort of foster. So, essentially that was a very good thing anyway. When we're trying to tackle very, very different problems in what are a lot of ways, sometimes too many people have a habit of kind of stifling things getting done differently. And we were solving different problems. We didn't want to be unduly swayed by wouldn't this also be really useful for this type of customer and this type of user over here? We didn't really want to get into that kind of just yet. End users for a proposition like this were going to be very different. Many of the people that we would look to support with something like this, they didn't write for us. Perhaps they would never write for us, and they might not necessarily care for our content, or at least not our subject discipline. We were talking about dangerous things like trying to speak to people outside the library, with a procurement process which is kind of vastly different to anything that we'd necessarily been experienced to, and therefore modelling different types of approaches was always going to be very, very challenging. Expectations of these user groups were going to be very different as well, not just kind of on the site itself that ultimately this would become, but kind of increasing the wider service we'd need to provide with respect to things like onboarding support and aftercare that a service or something like this is going to require a really new, unique service ethos for. And as the solutions were beginning to kind of manifest themselves somewhat, data was going to be very, very challenging as well. This was kind of transcending, in some instances, personal information into the very sensitive topic around potentially sensitive research information that people may or may not decide to sort of put in there as well. And our measures of success, subsequent reporting, they were going to look very, very different. Cost per download wouldn't be a metric for something like this necessarily. Usage in its broadest sense would be, but tracking the appropriate information was going to be new. And even now we still get very surprised, sort of furtive glances our way when we rock up at a research management conference and an event as a publisher. Trust is a big thing in this sector. Authenticity is a big thing in this sector, and how we talked about all the stuff that we were doing and positioning ourselves was obviously vitally important. Pulling like-minded people, I guess, away from that noise, immersing themselves into a single problem and area of focus was really rewarding. I guess what helped more was bringing the voices of a small number of customers, prospective customers, into this program. So with each feature that we kind of released to this solution, the formulation of the concept had been informed by a customer, the first iterations tested by a customer. It also meant that we could become, I guess, quite nimble midway through development sprints and cycles as well, and quickly pivot if things were slightly going awry. Oops. I'll move this on. There we go. I'll just quickly talk you through what this proposition ended up looking like ultimately. So it became a platform, an online platform designed to help in three ways. The first is kind of an impact health check, which is kind of like a diagnostic tool for either an institution or for a faculty. for those ultimately who wanted to take a good hard look at how they were kind of geared up and whether they were in a position where impacts and that kind of way of working could really thrive within their research institution. So the framework was based on research that was undertaken by Julie and David around looking at it through the lens of 5 C's. So the first was connectivity. How connected are all the various different stakeholders within our organisation when it comes to impact alignment? How clear are we in terms of what impact really means and what that's ultimately going to mean for our university? What's our level of commitment looking like? What sort of competencies do we have at our disposal or not indeed have at our disposal, and what's our approach to co-production? Effectively asks them questions along the lines of, do you even have an impact strategy? Where would it live? Who are your knowledge brokers within the institution? How are all these things pieced in together? And what it ultimately does is provide a bit of a sense check for where they kind of are and some of the areas they would want to try and focus in upon on their attention, which people can go back, review and make alterations to over time. The second component of it ultimately is a skills toolkit. It's aligned to an impact framework that again was created based on research that was undertaken. Selection of around about 200 pieces of learning content in there as well that we commissioned for this purpose for those who are living and breathing these challenges within institutional walls. Multiple different types of formats. It's in its first year, all of this as well, so what we're doing is trying to leverage some of the data and insight that we're gathering from some of our earlier customers to try and help create these into more formulaic learning pathways so ultimately people can make their get that one step closer to their impact objectives. And the final component to it is our impact planner, which I guess is kind of the engine of the service, if you like. It's for researchers ultimately to try and build in impact plans at the start of their project. So it kind of guides them through a process that says, before you start off on anything that you are doing, what problem are you trying to solve? Where is that being felt? Can you get a little bit more specific about where your contribution and piece of the puzzle is? You know, a lot of kickback people will get when it comes to impact is my work is not big enough, it's not meaningful enough. Funding is not necessarily going to be looking at that particular area, but it does need to connect to a bigger story. It's absolutely fine to have a really valuable contribution here, providing you can paint a narrative as to how that contribution is going to be felt in terms of the bigger picture over time. So it helps them to think about that, the change they're looking to affect as the work that they're undertaking, and then critically, the stakeholder collaboration aspect of this as well, which is an area of I guess, pressing concern with a lot of people about how they connect to the individuals that they need to. Think about the audiences that you're trying to reach at a very early stage in your project and who need to move certain levers for you in order for changes to actually occur, because it is unlikely to happen purely within institutional walls, and start thinking early around who those people are that you need to influence. Think about all the challenges, think about all the risks, and think about some of the evidence you need to track. Now, there will be some people far more intelligent than I that at some point will come together with an algorithm that will pull together various different metrics to turn into an impact score. We love one, right? Impact was good because it's a 4, it's bad because it's a 78.3, whatever that looks like. But at the moment, the best measures of success are looking at that in terms of indicators. So try and plot what good looks like over a particular pathway and try and look at those indicators over time and measure your performance against those. None of this being rocket science by any stretch of the imagination. But taking the approach and trying to move this a little bit further, I guess, away from the comfort zone of where we would live as a publisher has been very, very valuable. It gets us closer to trying to understand where some of the research trends are, because we're opening up to an audience that goes beyond where maybe we've traditionally been operating in the past, to get a lot more proximity to various different types of missions and strategies, and trying to build that kind of trust and advocacy piece for a group that has been feeling quite isolated for quite a significant period of time now as well, that has been quite a closed shop. Internal upskilling as well, I guess, within the business, you know, to be able to have a conversation that says, you know, both an author and a researcher, yeah, they are inevitably the same kind of thing, but we're talking about very, very different persona types depending on what they are doing on their journey. And it's also generating for us as well, I guess, just a lot of new ideas. We're already starting to see some really cool stuff, or think about some cool stuff about kind of connecting impact plans with specific funder requirements and even models as to how they could benefit funders themselves. We actually did a piece of work with the National Institute of Health Research, who were looking at this very, very closely around how they're kind of upskilling a number of their reviewers as well, and the lack thereof of kind of skills to be able to support that. Those who are kind of reviewing applications, that they still really need support in identifying and teasing out that impact and those impact pathways. So I will end things there. That's about 20 minutes. So that's actually not too bad versus the original. I'll pause for any questions. There are trains to be caught and drinks to be drunk, but I'm here if there are any questions. Thank you.
This is a really interesting product. I'm intrigued to understand how you got permission from your seniors to do something that is quite different from traditional publishing.
A lot of persuasion over quite a significant amount of time. Not actually helped by the fact that our CEO has become increasingly good friends with Julie Bailey, who's one of our contributing partners, and that very much helped. It kind of coincided at a similar time where we actually launched we called it an impact manifesto. And it was essentially a call to arms to say there is more to life than citations, basically, and trying to talk to some of these principles. And one of the elements around that was just thinking about trying to put some proof points in there. It's great to just talk it and put it on as a thing to say we think there should be better out there, but we don't know what it is. And we still don't know what it is. But I think what we wanted to try and do is at least try to demonstrate that we were in this for the long term, and that actually ultimately connecting with a wider group of people and trying to understand the barriers across the research workflow was going to be vitally important to help the central part of our business as well. I think we've been very isolated in one type of persona and one type of use case for a very, very long time, and we could play around those edges quite a lot. But I think looking at things a little bit further in the workflow was probably enticing to look at as what could this bring us? There's also been quite a push towards new innovation, thinking about things differently, probably some hangovers from actually doing the entire platform migration that was along the lines of, can we just think about something else for a while, please? But it was pushing against a relatively open door, but it still needed a bit of kicking at the same time.
Hi, thanks for that. It's an excellent product. My question is, when you measure impact, you're measuring impact so you can compare it with something. So you said that this is initially sort of produced for individual projects, departments, whatever. So is the idea that is this simply a sort of a consciousness raising so that people become more aware of how to generate more impact? Or is there an intention, or do you have a strategy to sort of to come up with some sort of score eventually, like Altmetrics or something, so you can say that this project had more, it can demonstrate had more impact than that project? And further than that, of course, you could, if you wanted, aggregate those stats from several institutions and come up with kind of things like quartiles or do some stuff. Is that part of the intention?
There'll be some phenomenally rich data around that kind of institutional profile that obviously would be there as well. I'm very mindful that there's going to be a lot of information in there as well that people don't particularly want shared, which is a very, very important thing here. And I think that's part of this trust piece. People don't like to necessarily, it's one of the, just being honest, it's one of the barriers, I guess, around sort of implementation of the health assessment. You go into a small group of people basically saying, let's find out what's wrong, and these are the areas that ultimately you are probably then going to have to sort out as well if anybody sees it, which is a very, very difficult conversation to have. However, yes, genuinely there's going to be some fascinating trends within that data around what areas are performing well and others. On the actual planning side of things for projects, possibly question number one we get from people is how can we track an evidence performance, because that's ultimately what we want to do. Depends who you speak to. A lot of people, when it came to the last Research Excellence Framework exercise, came out of that after we're never going to do that again and we're going to have to do things very, very differently, landed on, if only we had everything in one place. So now we need a big database to store all of this evidence in one place, and that will make our jobs a lot easier. You speak to the other half of the equation, they'll say that wasn't really the problem. The problem was you didn't even know what you wanted to track and record in the first place because you hadn't articulated at the outset what you were trying to go. So it grew tentacles, arms and legs along the way. So you could provide that as something there, but until the principles of impact literacy are more instilled, then I think you could be arguing that you're curating data that might not necessarily be working one way or another. So is it in the thinking for the longer term? Yes, it is. In fact, there are competitors out there who are already doing some really cool things around being able to do that kind of evidence tracking and monitoring. We, for now, are trying to stick to the principles of impact literacy and trying to sort of foster that as kind of a learning piece as much as anything else.
Thank you.
Two questions, I suppose, about how things have been going since you launched the product. So question one is, what kind of reactions have you had from institutions about a publisher coming and talking to them about something that's much more upstream of publishing? And I know lots of publishers are doing things in that space, but kind of curious sort of what reactions you've got, and also if there's anything you can share about how things have been going against what you expected when you set out.
Yeah, sure. First, still bafflement at the start. As I say, when we rock up at some of these events and we're talking about these things, we will often be the only publisher there. Then there's usually the question of, so what's in it for you? As you can appreciate. A lot of these things are really, really helped with the fact that none of this we did in isolation. We did not sit in head office and think we're going to solve the problems around impact literacy here, because who are we to do that? Every single step in this obviously was brought in with collaboration from people who are feeling this pain, understand these problems, and everything that's been created has been done so in conjunction with members of the academic community. And I think that's given us kind of a bit of a platform to be able to then sort of base those conversations. I will be honest as well, right at the outset of some of this work, I wasn't talking about Emerald Publishing at the start of this, or if I did, it was a footnote at the start before we were starting to talk about this narrative, because it does sit separately away. I think the reason those conversations have been able to be a lot easier, though, is because we've worked with individuals within that community to help bring this to life rather than in isolation. So that's kind of where that reaction is. Secondly, in terms of sort of reaction performance to date, we first tried to launch this during lockdown, so that was great. So we decided not to do that, and we pulled that back. This is its first full year, really, where we're looking at that sort of level of implementation. And we got off to a really good start. There were a number of UK institutions who've kind of taken this on. There's a couple of models to suit various different circumstances, so they've been taking that through. That's grown well in the UK. We looked at markets out in places like Australia as well, and again, we started to get some traction over there, but they're very much in the evidence stage of things at the moment, ultimately because their assessment isn't necessarily tied to funding. That makes the conversation a little bit trickier. Where we've been pleasantly surprised is actually when we've started to open up a little bit wider. South Africa, where the conversation is far more mature than we actually originally anticipated, where there's been a huge amount of interest in this as well, and in places like Malaysia. So it's performing well. My superiors would say it could perform better. They always would do, right? That's the way the world works. But I think what I've probably learned more than anything else around this is that whilst the conversation is very UK-centric, the appetite and demand actually goes far beyond that as well. Oh, okay, thank you.